Yeah. Hi, good evening, and thank you for joining us on day 291 at GGY. We have passed 290 days. Well done, guys.
Thank you.
290 days was on Sunday at our street corner. And we have a very special guest today, Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee. Thank you so much, Murtaza, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're most welcome. And we have our usual crew, Angeline, Pearlie, Maubrey, Veena Manik, and we have a few others at the back as well. So Murtaza, I'm gonna go into a little introduction. I know you didn't want a big sort of introduction, so I'll just say that we're honored to welcome you, chairperson of Advocata Institute. You lead this esteemed think tank focusing on promoting free market policies in Sri Lanka. With a background in finance and investment, you bring a wealth of knowledge and practical experience to our discussion. So thank you so much for joining us. Shall we jump straight in? So there was a lot of interest in talking to you, especially at this moment, considering all the sort of discussion going on around the country regarding the economic crisis, regarding the IMF bailout, the haircut that we've heard about, the Subaranjia that the country heard about over the last few days. To start the discussion off, Murtaza, would you be able to provide an overview of sort of the root causes of how Sri Lanka got into this mess in the first place? And leading from that, has any of these sort of fundamentals that led us to this been addressed legislatively or in any other manner?
Okay, thank you. And, I represent a think tank called Advocata Institute, and the word Advocata came from advocate. Okay. So that is one of the reasons I'm here today, because it is my role also to advocate and talk a little bit about creating greater economic literacy. So everybody is very familiar that this is a crisis of debt, and the debt was mainly in the hands of the government. It's a fiscal debt that had increased to a totally unsustainable level.
Right.
Now, many countries get into trouble, but it's not always a fiscal issue. So if you look at the East Asian crisis that happened in 1997, it was not a sovereign debt crisis. It was more to do with...
This is when those Asian tiger economies suddenly
sort
of collapsed, right?
It was more to do with excessive amount of debt in the private sector and in the banking system. They had an unhedged position and borrowed in dollars and lent in local currencies.
But created a bubble.
There was a massive amount of misallocation of capital.
Right.
In Sri Lanka's case, it's a sovereign debt crisis. The debt was there with the sovereign at a very unsustainable level. It was not a case of excess amount of private sector debt. And household debt is also very modest in Sri Lanka.
Right.
Because not many people get credit, or they get a very small amount of credit.
Right.
And we don't have a huge housing mortgage sector. Less than 10% of banking sector's lending is towards houses. So, ever since independence, we have been what you'd call fiscally profligate. So, if I was to explain in terms of basic fiscal accounting, the concept of a primary balance surplus, which means that the government's revenue minus expenditure without interest. And if you look at the primary balance deficits that we ran pretty large fiscal primary balance deficits for the first 30 years since independence.
Right.
So when you do that, which means revenue minus expenditure, you are adding to the debt, right? So every year you are adding to the debt. And then there's an interest on the debt that you are generating, which is also getting accumulated.
Right.
So after the first 30 to 35 years, we had accumulated quite a lot of debt. But of course, there was a lot of domestic debt, and the foreign debt was mainly, we used to get a lot of donor funding, and then we also used to get concessionary financing. So we had to keep on going to the IMF over the years basically because we'd have a balance of payment crisis. And many times this crisis is coming because the government is this-savvy. The problem, the current account issues are coming from the fiscal channel, that there is excessive spending for the government, less so with the private sector. So we had a lot of debt, but when it's domestic debt, all you have to do is to inflate it away. So if inflation is higher than, say, the interest rate that you're paying on it, you still can manage it because the nominal value of all your economic activity, which is captured in GDP, is growing faster than your debt. Right. But since the end of the civil conflict, we started embracing the international capital markets, and we started raising foreign debt on commercial terms. Now that didn't come at concessionary prices. Also, Chaminda, at this time, actually the central bank did a fairly good job. Finally, between 2010 and 2019, they were able to contain inflation like in single digit levels on an average. Right. So that ability to inflate the problem away was not a possibility. So now what you have is the interest rate is now becoming what you call a positive real interest rate. That if it was a negative real interest rate or adjusted for purchasing power, you are returning back less than you took. That's a simple way to think about it. Yeah. But when you get to a positive real interest rate, you have to return more than you took, adjusted for purchasing power. So in the decade leading up to COVID, we were accumulating a lot of foreign debt, and there is a misnarrative that all this debt was accumulated between 2015 and 2019, which is not true. Actually, it was accumulated in the 2010 to 2015, but it was in different forms. So for example, there was a lot of foreign investment in local government securities. This famous Templeton came and put like $2 billion or $3 billion in Sri Lanka. Yeah. All that had to be refinanced in that period 2015 to 2019. But there were also fiscal slippages. So there was a lot of foreign borrowings. So we, leading into Gotha taking over in 2019 end, we were very fiscally vulnerable. Right. And we all know how badly the Yahapalana government went, right? But there was another reason, more so than all the governance scandals, the bond scandal, and all the antics that President Sirisena did, constitutional coup, etc. That in 2016 and the first half of 2017, we had 3 back-to-back droughts. Yeah. Right. So when you have back-to-back droughts, your agricultural sector gets decimated basically. And although agriculture is only 8% of GDP, and the measurement of agriculture is up to the level of the crop. So for example, when you say rice, they only count paddy. Conversion of paddy into rice is agro-processing. So when you say 8%, it's only the growing. Similar in tea, it's only up to the tea leaf. So there was a big impact from the droughts and other misallocation of capital, because in that period 2010 to 2015 the growth was already slowing. It was only the catch-up growth that we had after the end of the conflict, 10, 11, we were okay because the whole country was now available for economic production. It was being countered also. Previously when the LDT was there, you couldn't even go to those areas. So coming into 2020, the economic growth model was seriously impaired, and these back-to-back droughts had also scarred the system. And then we had the 2019 Easter bombings, which we have now found out was the work of maybe perhaps a deep state. All of this had significantly impacted the dynamism of the economy, and we had become more and more protectionist. Right? So a lot of the growth that we were having, which was anyway slowing, was not coming in what is called the tradable sectors, which means that these are the sectors where you could import or export, which are then exposed to competition. Right. So you're forced to be efficient. But they were coming in by expanding the public service, because between 2005 and 2014, the size of the military doubled basically.
Right.
And then you had a huge boom in construction sector.
Infrastructure.
Yes, infrastructure, construction also. There are a lot of real estate development happening, etc. Right. So we had been misallocating resources. You're giving tax concessions, duty concessions for the wrong kind of things. I mean, there's nothing wrong in building apartments and condominiums, but there was no reason to put rocket fuel on that, right? So we were very vulnerable coming into 2020, and then the former Treasury Secretary P.B. Jayasundara, who has pretty much been the economic architect for almost 20 years, except for short periods, for some reason convinced his political masters, or whether it went the other way, that you could stimulate this falling economic growth by cutting taxes. And I believe the decision was done without wider consultation or modeling. So before you do these kind of things, which are very drastic steps, you have a lot of discussion and analysis and simulation. None of that happens. So you have the concept of a super secretary, like a extremely powerful bureaucrat basically, who then does not listen to anybody basically.
Who's also a political appointment.
Of course he is, and extremely political and ideological.
Right.
And also somewhat capable basically in his sphere. So you don't have strong institutions, but you have individuals with enormous amount of influence and power. And you have politicians and also somewhat capable basically. So in his field. So then this disaster has strong institutions, but you have individuals with enormous on which the financial markets basically already then start indicating that this is no good. And then COVID hits. By end of February, I think the lockup came.
Right.
So it was very clear that it was match over for Sri Lanka. Because there was no way under a lockup that economy is contracting. Some of your largest sources of foreign exchange, which is your tourism industry and your remittances, all are in peril now. Right. Even your normal export industries are all in trouble. So COVID basically was a nail in the coffin, but you were a dying patient anyway for a long period of time. Yeah. And then what happened was that they made, the technocrats kept on convincing their masters, who didn't understand better, that this is a liquidity crisis. But what it was a solvency crisis, that we were insolvent basically. Right. But they kept telling their rulers that no, this is a liquidity crisis. Yeah. And famously, this match was said that tourism will get you 4.3 billion in 2018, which itself is flawed. Yeah. Since you are in the industry, let me explain how this number is got. They look at the number of people who come to Sri Lanka and the number of nights that they stay. Yeah. And the combination of arrivals into nights is what we call guest nights. Yeah. And based on a survey at the airport, they estimate that the average spend per tourist is $180 per day. Yeah. And since you're in this industry, and some of the others, that we know that that's not true basically.
No, not at all.
Not at all.
I mean, so a very unscientific basis for a massive decision.
So they multiply the two, and that's how we get the 4.3. Right. So we know. So what they do is that you don't get a huge error figure, because they do a similar kind of number on outflows, like how many Sri Lankans go overseas into the guest nights, that they stay out into some arbitrary figure to make sure that there is not a big error. Yeah. That is why you don't get a huge error in the balance of payments.
Anyway,
So it was a false narrative.
Right. So anyway, at our peak in terms of the tourism industry, which was 18-19, that financial year, I think we did 2.3 million tourists, and
calendar year you did 2.3.
2.3, and I think we did about 5.2 billion, and that was at our peak.
4.3. So 4.3 was the highest.
Okay, that was the highest.
It's like this: 2.3 million arrivals into 10.5 average guest nights.
Yes, nights. Okay.
So the Europeans stay longer, the Asians less, etc.
Right.
So you multiply these things and you get 4.3. But what I was trying to say is that if you are overestimating this, there's no way to count it. It's an estimate.
Yes.
They compensate for that with Sri Lankans going overseas. And they say that, so many people go, so many nights they stay out, and they estimate that they must be spending so much so that you offset that. Right. So the narrative that was given that, we can service all this foreign debt, etc., the tourism will come. COVID will end, tourism will come back. Now, in the meantime, on your fiscal side also, because the economy has now contracted and you have cut your tax rates and exempted people and all that, your government revenue has completely collapsed. Right? And your spending has increased because of COVID. You had to help the poor, handouts, cash, etc. But major damage more than the spending was the revenue collapse. That I've been looking at the economy over a long period of time. We have never had a drop in the absolute level of government revenue. It was always a drop relative to GDP.
Right.
But here, in 2020, 21, I think even 22, there was a drop in the absolute level of revenue. Right? So if you look at it in terms of relative to GDP, because GDP kept growing, in some years, there was a steeper drop. So now we go on this charade for about 2 years, because the rating companies from 2020 say you're rating much. Right? And then round about October 2020, they downgraded us. Now the consequences of this rating is...
Which was also ridiculed by the people in charge at the time, right?
Yeah,
they said,
they didn't accept
rating
it.
agencies were wrong. And
There's always a conspiracy, right?
Yeah.
There's always a conspiracy theory that is put forward.
Right.
So you start shooting the messenger. And the problem here is that if you lose your rating, nobody ever, most borrowers never pay back their debt. They roll it over. Right? So countries don't really have to pay back their debt, because as long as the debt as a percentage of your economy size is in a manageable stage, somebody will keep lending it to you and you keep rolling it over, because the supply of funds in the world keeps increasing every year because it's growing, right? So when we started losing our ratings, there was no way that you could access the markets, right? That was shut out to you completely. Now, in the Yahapalana government, with the auspices of former Governor Indrajit Kumaraswamy, he raised $4 billion in 2019, basically, knowing that 2019 going into 2022 was an election year. Right? So, going into this crisis, if I'm not mistaken, we had about $6 billion of reserves. Right?
6 billion. 6 billion reserves.
So, what we did is that instead of trying to preserve that and saying that, okay, we want to restructure our debt, we can't pay it, misplaced ideology and misplaced arrogance made us continue our path. But we put rocket fuel on that path, because you did two things. One is that since your economy is contracting, the availability of your funds also have to contract, because if the supply side is under shock, there's less production, the demand side also has to contract. If not, then there will be too much demand chasing too few goods and you'll have inflation. But they didn't adjust the demand side. So what they did is they said, okay, we'll give you money basically. It's okay, you're giving it to poor people, it's fine. But remember that most consumption in Sri Lanka is happening amongst the top 20% of households. Right? although most of the necessities are needed by all households, people like myself who has a much higher consumption power probably do spend more than a lot of people in Sri Lanka. So they allowed my income to go up because you reduced my taxes. You allowed my purchasing power to go up because you foolishly kept the exchange rate through moral suasion. They terrorized the banks to keep it at 200, which made foreign goods cheap. You reduced interest rates to something like 6%, which made borrowing very cheap, or didn't incentivize savings. Right? So you went and spent on whatever because it didn't incentivize people to save. So, and you didn't revise electricity costs like for 10 years basically. And the costs were going up, over a period of time. And you kept fuel at ridiculously low levels. So just to give you an example of how misallocation happened, that for many companies, the first quarter of 2022 was one of the best quarters they had.
Remember that?
Yes, absolutely, and also individually, our PAY was significantly reduced.
But companies had demand off the charts.
Yeah.
So this so-called foreign exchange shortage that happened, they called it dollar shortage, etc., was due to two things. One is the companies were experiencing record demand. And they could also see that exchange was getting scarcer, and they expected the party to continue. So they wanted to buy more and more inventory. Right? So the demand for foreign exchange doubled up because your current demand is very high, and expectations of demand continuing in the future prompted many firms to double order, triple order. So their inventory positions were also at a very high level. So then catalyzed the panic behavior and accentuated the shortage of foreign exchange. And foolishly, that in the case of what are called Eurobonds, or what we call ISBs, they continue to service $2 billion worth of these instruments that should have been restructured long ago.
Yeah.
And I am pretty certain that certain people at the top of the central bank and government, there was an organized scheme that they were buying these instruments in the secondary market because they were trading at a significant discount. They are issued at $100, the par value. They came down to like 60 at a point. This is long before we defaulted.
Right.
And these people were buying these instruments, 60, 70. One, they went and told the banks, you also buy. But when they knew with certainty that it's going to be paid, so if you buy something at 70 and get 100 in less than 6 months or few months, the type of profits that you're making. Yeah. Right? So the motive to continue to do this was not only ideological or misplaced beliefs, but highly motivated by exploiting the situation.
Right.
Then we come to somewhere in April. We motivated the usable reserves exploiting this were less than $50 million. Then certain individuals who probably have more.
I think by June 28th, we were down to 50 million.
Exploiting or less. Actual figure is a lot less.
Yeah, then our foreign debt levels were at 51 billion. By June 28th,
all of the debt.
We were down. All the debt was 51 billion.
Not all the debt.
External debt was less. Then our foreign debt levels were at 51 billion. By June 28th,
so then we were down.
All the debt was 51 billion.
Not all the debt. External basically. And
sorry, quick question. That last tranche that was paid out
January 2022,
I think 500 million or something.
500 million.
Do we still have any transparency as to who was paid, what the motivation was behind that payment?
So the problem with these instruments is you don't know who owns them. Even the government of Sri Lanka, because we have a trustee, which is HSBC New York.
Right.
So we pay them and they pay the bondholders.
Okay.
Right. So even in the debt restructuring, in the negotiation, they put out a notice saying who are the holders. Right. If you don't want to be found out, you just keep quiet.
But doesn't that lack of transparency
But
create
that's
so
what's
many
happening
other
right
problems?
now.
I mean,
No, so that's the way the whole market works.
It's structured.
The people who buy these instruments may not want their names to be revealed.
Okay.
So this is where these guys also exploited, because it was very clear that you'll never find them. Who profited?
Okay.
Right? Some of these funds have to disclose their holdings every quarter, that you know. But therefore we were only able to identify less than 20% of the holders of these instruments. And these were like big funds like BlackRock and Ashmore and all, because they are all highly regulated and they had to reveal this. Some of them are like what we call passive funds, because we are part of the index, they have to put it.
Okay.
But I have no doubt that there were people profiteering from them, because anecdotally and through the grapevine, I was hearing stuff, from here, from Singapore, from various financial centers, that the murmur was that there are certain individuals who are really sure that this is going to be paid, and they are just coming and buying basically. So this all went on, and as I said, that almost 11 investment banks put out warnings saying that you're not good for the money. We belittled everybody.
Yeah.
So in essence, that Sri Lanka was vulnerable because of the wrong type of growth model, misallocation of resources for a very long time. And during the crisis, it was almost a perfect storm. And they did everything they shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
So that then finally ended up with a debt default. And what happened thereafter was exactly what they had to do. So we didn't have a market system, because shortages will never happen in a market system. And I'll explain to you, like, it was not, the narrative is that Ranil Wickremesinghe made sure that the queues went away and all. It had nothing to do with his magic hand. All they did was they allowed the market to determine the price.
Right.
The currency went from 200 to 370.
Yeah.
So automatically demand got destroyed. I told you that excess demand also, that all went.
Yeah, depressed demand. I mean,
Yeah.
we actually thought it was being done deliberately.
No. So if
Because
there's a
they needed
contraction,
to accumulate.
there's a contraction
reserves.
in demand.
Right.
And the supply response also came, that you are now being rewarded much more. So you had more money flowing in through, which was going through the informal channels. So it was market prices that did all the adjustment.
Right.
So what credit you have to give to the president, that he had the courage basically to allow the market to work. Right? So there was a lot of heartbreak, because the poor people don't have a coping mechanism, the rich people can. And this played out, and you can see that within 1 year after that, everything normalized. All the markets came into equilibrium. Right? So that is what happened basically. Now, so
at a cost to the public. I mean, in the sense,
wider-
inflation went up to almost, I think,
70%.
70-odd%.
So
We've
that-
not had deflation. I mean,
Yeah,
the cost
but-
of basket of goods still is at very high.
So those prices won't come down again.
Right.
Although some prices have come down, like vegetables and all. So those things, normally vegetables are very volatile because they get impacted by weather. You can't store. No?
Yes.
So that's why they're volatile. But so they get impacted when it doesn't rain and when it excess rains, etc. But overall, our economy is operating even now about 10% lower than its peak. So the vulnerable people at the bottom have really got impacted, and their coping mechanism has been to migrate, etc. But in the process, we got lucky. And I have repeated this many times, that the weather was in our favor. Weather has a big bearing. I keep repeating, the weather has a big bearing. So last year we were heading for trouble, because if you remember last August, it was hot, right? It was really hot. And there was an expectation, because it was an El Nino year. But because of a phenomenon called the Indian Ocean dipole, the positive dipole, where the western side of the Indian Ocean heats up and the eastern side is cooler, so the convection dumped all the rain on Sri Lanka in October, November, December. Because you remember that
Yes,
it was uncharacteristically wet.
Yeah.
And it messed up the tourist season also.
Yeah. But that would have helped with farming and power generation.
So when we started the year, all our reservoirs were full, irrigation tanks, everything was good. And this monsoon also is good. It's not a weak monsoon. But I have seen what the electricity board has submitted to the regulator for their new tariff revisions, and they are quoting the Met Department. They are expecting a weaker monsoon, the one that comes from the northeast. And that will have a big impact going into next year because that is the Maha crop. Right? This monsoon feeds the Yellow crop, which is like about 60% of the production of the Maha crop because the eastern side doesn't get the rain, right? So what is not irrigated, their production comes down. So that's kind of a summary of how we got here. But if you ask me what the diagnosis is, why this is happening to Sri Lanka, it is because of elite capture.
Elite capture.
So I have said this many times
Right.
that this country is run for the benefit of 1,000 people. And because I have been an activist and been in committees, etc., I can see how the connections work.
Yeah.
So that is the tragedy, and that is why many countries are poor, etc., because a handful of people, I mean, this
So essentially we're in a plutocracy.
it is a plutocracy. And if you read the book Why Nations Fail by Dan Acemoglu and Robinson, it's a very interesting, it's a economic history book of why the Industrial Revolution started in England. And it was successive forms of pluralism that developed from the Magna Carta over a long period of time basically, that allowed all this virtuous cycle of innovation and creative destruction, because in the country started, people had got the rights. But what has happened in Sri Lanka is a group of people have captured the state, right? So they are enriching themselves, right?
Self-preservation.
And
I think the political dynasties are a part of that, right? I mean, if you look at who's been in charge over the last 50 odd years.
It's more profitable to be in politics than to be in a business.
Yeah.
So
and
we can
also, Anjali, certain types of business. So I told you the growth of the tradable, non-tradable sectors.
Right.
So if you are in a tradable sector, certainly if you are exporting, political patriotism is going to help, right? So you have to be really good to be able to export. So even if you look at those business people, they are cut from a different cloth. Like even when you talk to them, because they have to strive harder.
Sure.
Then even products that can be imported, they are all in tradable sectors. But what we did is basically we put massive tariffs. So we have signed free trade agreements with countries, etc. So in order to circumvent what we have agreed to reduce tariffs, we have gone and put what are things called para tariffs, PAN, and something called CES. Which CES stands for Commodity Export Subsidy Scheme, which is for exports. I don't know how it came on the import side. Right. So you have now protected a group of business people from competition.
Right.
Right.
I mean, some industries are virtual monopolies, right? We know, we don't need to name names. Chris, you know very well, right?
And
construction industry.
Construction inputs, right? So you know, this is why we probably, and this is why it impacts the livelihoods of the average Sri Lankan, because his house probably costs 30% more than it should, or he has to settle for a less quality house because he can't afford it basically. Right. And you are enriching a certain class and making them inefficient. Right? And so, for example, I have actually taken this up with Angelina also sometimes, that there is a lot of argument in the hotel sector. They are debating the price. But my argument, it costs too much to build. Right? So if you go to Thailand or something, I mean, it's ridiculously low. But they can't be misallocating all the time. They've got a business loan. Their costs are much lower. Right? Because there are a lot of competition, etc. So how this plays out is that it is distorting a lot of things.
That's why you can see that the actual hoteliers are not investing. It's all a different segment.
Yeah,
that
it
seems
is
to
a vanity
have, that
asset,
is picking up even the available properties that can't run.
We saw a boom after 2009.
Yeah,
sort of,
who are all the
business
new
people
players?
coming into all new players.
They're all new
No,
players
but
who are actually in
they
some
are
other
all
business.
investors, They are now, if you look in the banking sector, in the hospitality sector, lodging sector, but 30% NPA.
Yeah. Actually, traditional hoteliers sold and left.
The artificial,
Like Continental Group.
Yeah.
growth in the tourism sector cost, isn't that related to the artificial rate of construction, high rate of construction? Isn't that's one of the main reasons why tourism, the hotel sector?
No. I mean, it's a vanity asset. No, I always say people see it as an extension of their house and they think it's easy. So I was basically, because my day job is the capital market, I was about 2 years ago, this was after COVID, then we had another crisis. No? And I was with a group of people who were trying to set up a distress hospitality fund. And then they were shortlisting the kind of assets that were available. And I was startled to see the type of people who have got into this. Now one fellow, a Ukrainian fellow also, who was like an IT guy who had made some hotel somewhere near Vadua. So all sorts of odd lot of people, because the barriers
not
to
the
entry,
traditional hoteliers.
yeah, the barriers to entry in this sector are very low. No,
Yeah,
you just
exactly.
they think you get an architect and you build. But the point I like to make is that it costs too much, and you will never, however much you shout and say no, you must increase the tariff and all. It's a tradable sector. No, I mean you would know better that a beach in Kenya is a substitute to a beach in Sri Lanka. I mean, somebody who is coming from the northern hemisphere, I mean, he's not going to say, I'm only coming to Sri Lanka. So we have to be competitive, basically.
And we are not. So this is maybe a good time to get into some of our other issues.
Yeah.
Isn't the tourism sector the major foreign
Not,
exchange
no.
earner for us?
No.
For this country? No. Why?
No, so I said that if you look at flows, the remittances are double what tourism bought at its peak.
Remittances with employment.
Yeah.
Yes. So that is not
Yeah, that is number one.
6 billion. It's
Yeah.
like
But
heading-
for the country now needs foreign exchange.
I think even apparel is still higher, no?
No.
not apparel.
Yeah, you have to be very careful because say like apparel will be like 5 billion, but a lot of imported
Imports
stuff.
70% is import.
Also, it's all driven by capacity also. No?
Yeah.
So I think now, I mean, even when we achieved that peak number in 2018-19, our plant was running at about 80% capacity.
But also, less beds. Now
Exactly.
we
Now
have
we have
increased
dou-
doubled
almost
our
doubled the
beds.
number
Look
of
at
beds,
Colombo
and
is
we
a good
can't
place to
reach-
look at.
Exactly.
Right? Colombo has, increased
the
their
point-
capacity.
I will explain, I mean, there is, and I will try to explain that very important thing that people misunderstand about foreign exchange. The narrative, they say valuable foreign exchange and all. There's a complete misnarrative, and I will try to explain that to you. But why the tourism industry is important to Sri Lanka is because you have a very high trickle-down effect. Right? So 50% of the room inventory in the country are establishments with less than 20 rooms. So unlike any other industry, lots of people benefit from it. Like the guy who gives you the surfboard, the guy who brings the beer can. So that way it has a high people-to-people contact, and a lot of low-skilled people get income.
The tuk-tuk drivers, everything.
Yeah,
So it's actually unlike, because of these platform companies like Booking.com, etc. It has now allowed a large supply chain of it. And
it's commoditized, that market.
yes, and it lifts all those areas, and because the platforms are now allowing you to open new geographies. So people know these are there, etc. That's a separate discussion. But I think, Chaminda, if I can, I want to explain this biggest myth about this foreign exchange. There's a complete misunderstanding about this. Now, the issue why we have this repeated crisis is because we have too much of consumption and investment. It is nothing to do with the fact that we don't export. Right? Because if you have X amount of dollars coming in, you have to manage with that. Right? So if you look at the basic relationships in economic accounting, the current account is basically called the savings investment gap. Right? And the reason you have a savings investment gap is to do with fiscal policy and monetary policy. It has nothing to do with exports. Right? So what happens is that you can break it into two forms of savings. You have the government savings, which is the revenue minus recurrent expenditure, and then you have non-government savings. In Sri Lanka, the government savings is a dis-saving. It's a huge dis-saving at the moment also, because your interest to GDP is so high, 8.5%, one of the highest in the world. Right? Yeah. Your non-government savings is high, the households, the firms. So now what is happening is the government dis-saving is reducing because they're collecting more tax revenues. So you and my savings are going down because my taxes are going up. It's highly unlikely that we are consuming less. Certainly I am not consuming less, but certainly my savings are going down because the taxman is taking more of it.
Well, they need to cover the deficit. I mean, every year.
So fiscal is important because if they don't collect enough revenues, they will run with a dis-saving. So then you have less savings, right? Second thing is if you overinvest. So if the government is making larger investments, if the people are going and investing a lot, and that is where interest rates count, that is monetary policy. That if you keep interest rates high enough, it will dissuade you, it will incentivize you to save because you are being rewarded with a real return, and it will disincentivize you from investing because the hurdle rate of return is higher. Right? So our problem is what economists call is an absorption problem. There was too much of consumption, too much of investment. That is what's sucking all these imports in. Right?
So our economic activity
is too high.
Too high.
You had to tone it down. Right? So what they were trying to do all along was overstimulate the economy. Right? So if you overstimulate above your capacity, you are going to run out of resources, which is what is happening. Now the export part basically is that.
So quickly, so and all that economic activity and all that investment came through foreign borrowings, right?
No, so because you were overstimulating, you were running a savings investment gap.
Right.
The resources in the country were not sufficient, so you were importing savings, which is your current account balance. So the part of the exports, why you need to export, is that increases economic activity. So now when you export, you are selling to somebody else, you are not selling to your own people. Right. So you are increasing output. That is why we need tourism, etc. Because basically you don't need tourism because you have exchange problem. You need tourism because it will create more employment, increase economic activity. People will get more income in their hand. But even if you have a very successful tourism sector and you have a very good export sector, if you don't follow the right monetary and fiscal policy, you will still have a problem. Because if you overspend, if you overinvest and don't save enough, you are still going to have a savings investment gap. Right? So this is where it is so important that two key pieces of legislation have happened in Sri Lanka. The independent central bank, which says that no longer do they set interest because they want to make the government's borrowing costs low. And they don't have economic growth mandate, they only have to make sure that inflation is within the targeted 5%.
So monetary policy comes under them, and it needs to be an independent institution to govern.
Yes,
but does it function that way?
I mean, the law has only come into being like 8 months ago, right? So we have to see, but we have seen previously how much. There's a complete misunderstanding of what this independence means. Even I have seen AKD talking about this. He's sometimes confusing accountability and policy independence. obviously the central bank is accountable to parliament, etc. But you are ring fencing their decision making on monetary policy based on what is good for the economy, and their main target is basically to ensure that there is price stability, that to keep inflation. Now they have agreed to keep it at 5%. At the moment it's going below 5%, right? But they say that no, the inflationary forces will pick up going forward because there's a base effect. Like the prices went very high last year, so they don't keep on going up and up and up.
You're already at a very high. Should we ask some of the questions that are main ones?
Sure.
Let's go for that.
So if I can finish that. So you have an independent central bank, and then on the fiscal side, that they have passed a new law called the Fiscal Management Act, or going to pass. That will put more constraints on spending, and they have to keep on raising revenue. They can't run a huge budget deficit. So when you put these two together, and the IMF's own target of at least 1% current account surplus, this massive collapse in the currency and all, it's not going to happen again. Right? It won't happen again, basically. But the thing is that when you don't stimulate, your economic growth is going to get impacted. And therefore, the only thing that you can now do is improve productivity, which means doing more with less. And for that, you need competition. Right. And that competition issue is integral to what I said about elite capture. That when you have elite capture, you are going to have competition. And without competition, you can't improve productivity. You have less dynamic firms, you have less dynamic people, because all of us know that under competition we do better.
Nishant told us about all the...
It's better for the consumer.
The transparency, that's
it's
with
better
lack
for
of
the
transparency,
consumer,
right?
it's better for the employee, it's better for the firm. Of course, the weaker firms don't
make it.
That's
market forces.
So this is where the political conundrum happens, that you are now moving towards a meritocratic system. And currently, our system is not a meritocratic system.
It's not. So
the wrong people are in the wrong places and who are captured and enriching themselves. It's called economic extraction.
Right. So years of sort of governance failure, bad policy, fundamentals are all wrong, and then we came to the inevitable collapse. I think that. So, like you said, even before Gotabaya was elected, the fundamentals were completely off.
Let's put it already like this: you are vulnerable.
We were vulnerable at that stage.
And you are getting more and more vulnerable. Although they tried in 2015 to 2019 to try to change ship, but all the governance failures and those 3 back-to-back droughts derailed them. And by about half the term, they couldn't do anything because there was just too much of noise and everything had gone haywire. And RW and Sirisena had fallen out and nothing was happening.
Right. So all of that brings us to the IMF, which we know is a means of last resort. I mean, Harsha De Silva in 2020 was advocating that we go to the IMF before the collapse. Our reserves were down. I mean, I think was that the right time to go? I mean, did we go too late, or was there another path?
No, so we were already in the IMF program, and after PB came, they exited. They refused to adhere to the conditions.
The 16th one.
16th one. So by the time the crisis came, it was very clear that you had to go under an IMF program, because what the IMF does is it tries to put you back into a more sustainable path. And the money that the IMF provides is only gap funding. Right? So it designs a program to put you on a path, which means that excess demand is reduced and imbalances are corrected. So they will say, okay, let prices reflect their scarcity value, etc. And then they say, okay, the World Bank, ADB, etc. will give so much of what are called program lending. And then they will look what is the gap funding. Right? The gap funding is what they give you. But they can't lend into what are called lending into arrears. That if they believe that your debt is unsustainable, they don't want you to take their money to pay credit.
Right. So between 2000 and 2020, we were under multiple IMF programs, right? But
most of it which we never completed.
We never completed, and our foreign debt went from 9.2 billion in 2000 to 56.3 billion in 2020. So doesn't the IMF have some say in how we borrow? And out of that, 42% of our borrowings came from the markets.
Yeah, so they don't have a say. They only have a say when you are in trouble and go to them, basically.
Okay.
But the thing is that our per capita income also started growing. So we were no longer a low income country.
Okay.
We became a middle income country.
So borrowing became
Easier.
and part of the...
So during that, because I've been in the capital markets, there was a debate at that time that the market would discipline you.
Okay.
Right? So the thinking was that you go and borrow from the markets. If you misbehave, they won't forgive.
Okay.
Right? So markets were signaling, but as long as we could keep on rolling over, don't forget that globally there was a global financial crisis.
Yes.
So interest rates came down to like 1%, 0.5%, like that.
So cost of capital became much cheaper.
So there were a lot of investors who were seeking yields. They were getting so little in developed countries. They came to much more riskier credits because they were searching for the yield. So they were more accommodative. Right? So under normal situation, they may have thought twice before they subscribed to our debt.
Yeah.
But since the party was going on, I mean, we were such a small part of the whole global debt market that there were some brave souls, speculative, and nothing happened for 10 years, right? We started issuing from 2005.
Yeah.
So from 2005 to 2020, things went very well. I mean, we were rolling it over. They were getting like 6% interest.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Just to go back to what you said about competition, where do you see the competition within the country, or do we have to get the imported elements?
No, so if you open out your borders to trade, the goods don't even have to come. It's the threat of competition is enough, and that is called contestability.
Okay. So
let me explain something that people don't understand. So contestability is a threat of competition. So if an industry is contestable, it's like you are allowed to get into the ring, right? Competition is the fight at the rivalry, the intensity of the fight. And competitiveness is how to win. How to win the fight. So if I'm using boxing as a method. So sometimes, although they go and say that no, all the imports will come and swarm, you don't need the imports. Sometimes they won't even come. But there's a threat that imports can come. That makes sure that your people don't try to exploit or become efficient.
Right.
How does all these affect our small and medium businesses?
So they are a convenient cloud to hide your sins, basically. The small man, even in the parate, they say that you suspended parate to save them. But it's not.
No, it's not.
One day I was talking about these things at a bank. They had called me to give my views. It's a major private bank. And the guy who was in charge of recoveries, this thing, he said, we have an association amongst the banks, the officers in charge of this. And he said, look, we have all lent to the same 50 people.
And they fall, a lot of them.
So that goes to your point about the captured state, right?
So those people, basically, they are all what you call willful defaulters. They are not hard luck cases.
You can't let them fail.
So,
because you fail, the bank fails if you let them fail.
No, more than that, Anjali, it's not too big to fail. Right? This is willful defaulters who basically are rich in their own right. They have kept the money, etc. But they are feigning ignorance and telling stories because they want to keep enjoying it at somewhere. And this is.
But what are the companies that really drive the economy here? It is the large corporations, which is very few, or the medium and small, medium business as well.
So there was the Department of Census and Statistics did something called the Establishment Survey, 2013 to 2014.
Okay.
They identified 1 million enterprises who basically employed 3 million people. 91% of those establishments had 4 or less people working. So what were called large enterprises, which by memory had more than 100 people, accounted for only, they were like 1% of all establishments or less. But they accounted for only 25% of that 3 million. And the threshold was only 100.
So in a global context, we're a very small economy.
No, not global context, even
Even
Sri Lankan
from Sri Lankan
context.
context,
And I have 2 slides which I normally show, like I put the brands of companies we know. But then I have another slide, a collage showing Trisha Driver, Mulat Seller, Cobbler. There's a lot of those guys. And if you take our labor force, 70% of our labor force is informal.
Informal.
Only 30% are formal, of which about 50% of that is with the government and 50% is with the private sector. Formal private sector.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into like tax avoidance and all of that,
Yeah.
but we have a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah. Shall we go into some of them?
So quickly, so now, we just talked about the IMF bailout and why we needed it. And key part of that was domestic debt restructure and restructure with foreign debtors, the haircut that was announced recently, rather triumphantly as Subaranchia. Did we get what we needed to get out of the domestic, the foreign debt restructure with the...
So there is a lot of misunderstanding on these things, right? I believe that the bilateral creditors, so there is about 10 or 11 billion owed to the ADB, World Bank and IMF. These are called multilaterals, right? So multilateral, the word multilateral means there is more than one owner. Bilateral means one. So you do not normally restructure multilateral debt because it's given on concessionary terms, and they anyway keep financing. Right? So that's
your ADB, that's your
World Bank,
World
ADB.
Bank, all of that.
ADB, I think, is bigger than World Bank. ADB, World Bank, IMF. Right?
ADB to Sri Lanka was 10% in 2021. I don't know where it is now.
So then you have the bilaterals, right, which is 111 billion. Of that, 50% was owed to China. Right? India was $1.5 billion. Then Japan. Japan actually was bigger than India. So that is this deal that we are. Now there is something called the Paris Club, right? That is a group of developed countries who kind of come together because they can negotiate together, especially when they are all linked to similar country. So what we did was whatever we owed, now we had suspended debt payments since April 2022, they agreed to refinance, which means that they did an agreement with us to extend our payment maturities. And I don't know the exact details, but I get the feeling that we will be paying these people back the principal payments from 2028 to 2042. So you're buying a lot of time to pay back. And the interest rate is set at about 2%. So today, if you go to the market and borrow, Sri Lanka will probably pay 10%, 11% very high. So you have got it at 2%. And therefore, what people get confused about this haircut, yes, the absolute amount of money that you have to pay is not changed, but you are being given more time.
Right.
And you are paying it with a much lower interest rate. Yeah. So how to look at it is something called NPV, so you net present value. And if you do the maths, and I haven't seen any details, I'm guessing that it's about 20% on NPV basis. So we have got a big haircut.
So 20%, is that
roughly? That's what I think it is. I haven't seen the details. Because but you can think about it like this, Chaminda, that your discount rate, they take 5%. You're paying 2%.
Yeah.
So that difference is the discount over like 20 years.
Right, and which amounts to about 20%. Now, other countries like Ghana, we know got a much higher value sort of as a haircut, right? I mean, that's what we've been hearing. So why could we not negotiate something of that nature?
No, so the thing is that it also depends on what interest rate you borrowed at.
So we were already at very high interest rate.
No, not for bilaterals.
Yeah, from the markets.
From the markets, you borrowed at very high
Yeah,
levels.
but the problem is our exposure to the market is the
they,
highest.
so they look at it like this. It's not that what the IMF said is that there is a external debt servicing threshold, which was set at 4.5% of GDP. So all your debt had to make sure that no more than 4.5% of GDP you can pay a year. So this negotiation is within that envelope.
Okay. Well, I mean.
So why is that they're not putting it out, telling exactly
the fine print? Because that's what seems to be missing, right?
No,
the fine
so
print.
I feel that it will come out. It's a matter of time. One thing is when you're negotiating, you can't tell these things. And we are also negotiating with the commercial creditors. But all this in the debt bulletin, there's something called the debt bulletin or something. Every 6 months they put all this will be there.
Actually, your point earlier about the captured state is also illustrated in this restructure of domestic debt where only the EPF was really touched. So, which affected the most vulnerable in this country.
No, so in that the story is a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
And in my opinion, outrageous what happened. So at the time of they had to do the domestic restructuring because clearly the local debt is at a very high interest rate and it is piling up, it's compounding, right? So
interest on interest.
Yeah, at the time of June 30th, 2023, by memory, we had about 9 billion in bonds. And we had about 5 billion in treasury bills. Right? So put 9 and 5 together, it's 14. And there was some other domestic debt not in rupees. Now all that has, what was that time about 14.5 billion or 14.5 trillion is now like close to 17 trillion because the interest is piling up. Right? So of the treasury bills, 50% was with the central bank. They had fund, that's the so-called money printing. Right? So what they did is that they said, okay, we will exchange those for bonds that will get paid off over 15 years. Right? And initially we will make the interest rate I think 12% and after 4-5 years it will come down to 10 or something and the final 5 years it will come down to 5% or something. Right? So now since the central bank is owned by the government basically, you got rid of, you made 50% of the problem sustainable. But anyway the central bank is owned by the government, so if the government was paying interest to the central bank, it would have come back to the government as profits basically.
Yeah, exactly.
These are the proponents of this so-called modern monetary theory who says that it's a costless thing, that you can go on creating money without it costing until it creates inflation, which is what happened in the US, etc. The 9 billion basically comprised, if my calculations are correct, 7.1 billion, 7.1 trillion of the 9 trillion was at an interest rate of about 10%. Okay. 1.9 trillion was issued during the crisis, starting in 2022. So by about April 2022, the interest rates were already about 25%. Right? It started inching up from January. So if you take those bonds, now normally bonds are much longer dated securities, the average interest rate was 27%. So if you take the 9 trillion in bonds, they had an interest rate about 13%, of which 7.1 trillion was at 10 and 1.9 trillion was at 27. Okay. So what they did is they said, okay, we are only going to restrict the perimeter on the debt basically to the superannuation funds who own 43% of the debt. The EPF was 33, the others were 10. So the ETF would have been about 5.5. And there are private ones and electricity board and central bank and the banks, all of these people. So what they said is that we are going to force you basically to exchange that for bonds that had a yield of about 10%. But at the time it was issued, they were yielding about 12%. So you have to give back all your bonds, and we will issue new bonds, which also run up to some 2037, 2037, right? And as I said, that will have a much lower yield, right? So now the story that they made was, no, we can't do that to the banks. Now I said the superannuation funds had 43, the banks had 42, right? And the state banks are 50% of that, right? So they said, no, if you do that, it will significantly impact the banks, etc.
Well, they were talking about a bank run and all sorts of things. I mean,
So-
we heard
We had a 5-day holiday,
stories.
remember?
Yeah, absolutely.
Everything was
Yeah.
closed for 5 days.
So I did not have all the details like they had, but there were other people also having these instruments. So famously they said that, when it was asked, why did you leave out individual bondholders? They said, no, they only own 1.2% of the total. Now the problem that they didn't, so I told you that 7.1 was at an interest rate of 10, 1.9 was 27. And what they replaced was at 10. Only thing, the maturity is a bit longer basically. They stretched it out, right? The issue was that although people shouted about the EPF, etc., they didn't get too bad a deal.
Oh, they didn't?
They didn't.
Okay.
If you do that NPV analysis, the loss was only 3 to 4%. So obviously somebody will ask the question, how was it so low?
Yeah.
Right?
But we also never got the rationale. I mean,
No,
in the
it
sense
was
that
just
there
easy to do.
Yeah.
It was easy to do, That
But didn't
Because
some
it-
people
because it was
make
such a- it
out
was such a
with
huge-
much more than what they were expecting? Because
No,
there was an
it was
expected
like this,
haircut on
Anjali.
those
The
domestic
reason you
ones.
could do it for a pension fund is the pension funds, how they work is they have inflows and outflows. So all of us who pay into the EPF, money goes in. Those who retire, money goes out.
Yeah.
The rest is just rolled over. It's like a accounting
It's the biggest fund we have in this
And also
country.
it's the one that's most misappropriated, right? Because
No,
it's
it's
bought
like
from-
this, Anjali. It's like an accounting entry because you keep on investing in the government. So they will have a problem if they have a liquidity crisis. Then there is more money going out than
coming in. Yeah.
Right. So they don't have
that
to
won't
worry,
happen. I mean-
which happened last year.
It did?
The first
because,
time.
because we had all this mass migration and so on. So people
Lots of
living-
people withdrew
leaving,
because
yeah.
you can withdraw at 55. I don't know whether they increased the thing.
They did not.
60,
They increased.
Yeah.
60.
No, not overnight. Not overnight. It's going up gradually.
Yeah.
But what happened is there are a lot of people who continue to remain in the EPF who are above 55.
Oh, right, okay.
Because most people don't retire at 55.
Yeah, so who hadn't taken the funds out, who
They
suddenly
pulled.
needed the money up because there was no income during the pandemic.
So, not during in 2023.
Up post-pandemic.
After all this debt restructuring,
Okay.
people got scared and pulled it out.
Right.
Okay. So they don't have to worry about losses at all because as long as inflows exceed outflows, they are fine basically.
Okay.
Right. So it was easy to do.
Right.
Now, as I said, that they didn't get too bad a deal, and the loss was only 3 to 4%. Now the issue is this: you might be wondering how on earth was the loss not great? I told you about those crisis bonds, the 1.9 trillion. They did not have 43% of that.
Oh, right, okay.
My estimate is they only had half of that.
Okay.
Right? So they had more of those low yielding bonds and less of those high yielding bonds. Right? Other people bought it. And remember, I famously said that individuals, the excuse that was given is they are only 1.2%, forget that.
Yeah.
But what they didn't tell you is that before 2022, the individuals only had 0.2% of the bonds. So my estimate is the delta that increased, they probably had 6% of those crisis bonds.
So they really made out.
Yeah. So if you owned a 10-year instrument, your holding period was less than 1 year by the time they announced it. You made a return of 100%.
Yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah. Right? And the
Yes,
capital
that's what happened.
gains, if
But
you
only
make a
tax.
capital gains, tax is on 10%.
Yeah. So you just
So I am estimating that maybe 100 or 200 individuals who held majority of them got a profit for 40 to 50 billion.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
so,
we know.
Right?
I mean, there's always.
that's just the individuals.
Yeah.
But similarly to banks, etc., which are owned again by private individuals and highly concentrated, you will see some banks, they made huge net interest margins.
Yeah.
So what you did is, now the thing is that there are two sides of the equation. By not restructuring those bonds, I am estimating that the government left 300 billion on the table of extra interest per year.
Okay.
So you take 1.9 trillion, Chaminda, and multiply by 27%, you will get a figure, right? Only 22% of that got restructured. So the rest, we are still paying interest at 27% yield. And all of that will not, I mean, all of that is not going to be there for another 10 years. You know, some were issued 5 years.
Sure, there are different
years,
lengths
3 years.
for the bonds to mature.
So our total interest cost is 2.8 trillion.
2.8
trillion.
Which is time to go into this, right? Because we are running quite late
so
now.
I know. I mean, your knowledge is almost encyclopedic when it comes to these things.
Yeah.
So we just slightly changing track.
The key, okay, we can go to the other things, but the key thing I want to say is, you know, even in the crisis, it is a few who are super enriching themselves.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think there is no burden sharing.
Right. I think that is the common thread here.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we are in this captured state, and how do we break away from this?
Yeah, and
but so can we? If you can just twist, if you can just turn things around, because we have taken a lot of time.
I know.
Okay.
I just want to ask one thing.
Yeah, okay.
All these loans, are we paying interest now more? Even the interest fees will be paid after 28.
No.
It's
So
interest
there
accumulating.
was, till you restructure, it's called interest in arrears. Interest in arrears.
Yeah.
So in the ISBs, at the time of default, we had $12.5 billion outstanding.
Yeah.
Right? We have still not done a deal, but the interest on that is now 2 billion. That is called interest in arrears. Right? So that also gets restructured.
Yeah.
But all of it needs to be paid at some
At
point.
some
We're
point.
just kicking the can down the road.
So for
That's what we're doing.
example, the deal that the government put forward is the principal amount they asked for 30% haircut. The 12.5 billion, they want a discount of 30%. On the arrears, which will 2 years, it's 2 billion, they want a 20% haircut. But still we have to pay the other 80%, which is 1.6 billion.
From now to 2027.
No, that gets all
Accumulated.
No, that gets restructured over a long period of time.
Over a period of time.
Let's
So one of the reasons we're in this is because of this massive governance crisis that that precipitated the economic crisis. And the one thing that we haven't seen are solutions to this. I mean, just to kind of highlight this, the recent visa scam. The visa scam, people call it the VFS scam, and so on. So suppose the president tried to justify the scam by pointing out that the users pay for this, it's a fee, and so on. I'll bring both topics together because it's multiple questions. Also, we saw the Adani, the power purchase agreement, where the bids were opened, and it turns out like the local bidders were at much
almost
cheaper,
half
cheaper
what
rate, and so
they
on.
have given it out to.
Yeah. So
and both are unsolicited proposals.
Yeah.
Without considering local suppliers. So both have that same common thread.
Right. So, I mean, do you see merit in the justifications being given to these projects?
Yeah. So if you look at the visa, was there a need? Right. So it is very clear that there were small gaps, but we had a system that worked fine for 15 years. And very long time ago, I also studied computer science, and these were easily fixable by our people. All Mobitel asked for $1, and there was some part in the back end that informatics also had to do. And I believe that the dollar was going to be used to fix both parts, but mine is third-hand information. So there was no great need to do this. What surprises me is that the people who did this thought they can get away with it, which is mind-boggling, because if you go and
we have got away with it.
Well, we'll see.
Well, hang on.
Yeah.
We're waiting for the COPE report,
Well,
right?
there has been a furor, no? There's been a furor. The
Report is not coming out.
Yeah.
you can go and build a Lotus Tower, and sometimes it's too opaque. You really don't know how much you overpaid. Obviously, we shouldn't have built a Lotus Tower.
$4 million.
But this one, every transaction you see $25 going.
Yeah, and in AED to a foreign company.
But do you buy the argument that because it's paid by the user, that it doesn't matter because it doesn't cost the government anything? Do you buy that argument?
So, this is a classic case of what is the economic cost of corruption,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So, it's not only the $25,
Yeah.
but there are about 8 reasons how corruption impacts economic development. So, you are then allowing one set of people to enrich themselves. Second thing is that there is no connection between the price you are charging and cost. It has tremendous ramifications because it is driving up the cost of getting to Sri Lanka. Right? So you have so much distortions, and I come back to this question. I mean, it's so visible. I really like to do a psychoanalysis of the people who are behind this, which I think is quite a group. If they thought they can get away with this.
This is what I've been saying all along. I mean, it is so transparent that if you scratch beneath the surface, it'll all come out.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
we have seen parts of the
you keep
agreement
paying
ourselves.
the $25 to,
Yeah, and it's
and then you say, what am I paying
And
for?
over 10 years.
The system is so bugged that it takes at least 4 days sometimes to get even a visa. So what we had was a much better, system.
Of course.
So
And
someone said today there was a big expose on the 4 days of obstacles to get a visa. Said O-level computer science person could have done a better site.
job.
Yeah.
Also, Angeline, you must understand that what was called, somebody had pointed this out to me. ETA means electronic travel authorization.
Yes, it's not a
It
visa.
is only the right to come here.
Yeah, exactly.
You
It's a
get
pre-authorization.
Yes,
So you
get
actually
that.
chopped in the-
You get the visa
On arrival.
Exactly. I try to point this out many times, but also when they implemented the new system, the data capture became a little bigger. So
And
that was
a
sort of like a
nuisance,
justification.
because we didn't need that.
Yeah.
We didn't
I
need
think
for a
40,
tourist visa. You don't need that.
32 new points of data were being captured by the new system, whereas earlier it was only like
Yeah.
4 or 5.
Yeah.
It was basically like
more than 4 or 5.
it
No,
was
the
passport number.
that obviously
Right,
your name,
duration,
your full
Yeah, it
name.
was about
But there
five.
were address fields and all. I have seen all
Yeah,
that.
but it was something 24
simple.
hours, very
Far
fast,
simple.
furious, it came out. But if you look, and also look at what we are fighting against, because if you look at
Yeah.
Maldives, Vietnam, Thailand,
Yeah.
Malaysia, I mean, almost
Yeah.
all our competition is free visa with just almost
well, now even the free visa countries have to pay a processing fee.
yeah,
So
and
it's
that
not really a
goes to
free
where?
visa. So
Yeah, so there's no free
that
visa.
makes no sense. But
So, Jaminda, one of the things in that particular thing
Yeah.
is this is the tragedy that the guys who were not in the cut basically started making a noise. Right?
Well,
Then they gave them,
Yeah.
they have stopped shouting.
yeah, absolutely. There were people who threatened to resign,
So,
who are now
yeah.
so you can
justified.
see that how disconnected they are with the rest of us.
Could you tell us why the COPE committee is reluctant? Do you have an insight into that? Could it be the composition of the committee itself? Could that be the issue?
So, I mean, having been in many committees,
Yeah.
even a chair basically is only the chair, right? They have to
Exactly,
go
chair.
with the majority.
Right.
So, I hope that it will come out because this is all there in the public domain, right? So this has, the thing is that our people also now take the other case that you talked about, the wind power. There were some misstatements there. So what they try to do basically is this is a completely unsolicited proposal, right? Now we don't have a procurement law because
Including the visa. Was
It's not
unsolicited
totally
proposal
but
too?
still we don't have a law. We have guidelines,
Right.
right? Now I do an interview with one of the key people who wrote up the IMF governance diagnostic assessment, and I asked the question, why do you need a law? And he explains clearly. More than guidelines, because under the law then you could have easily gone after them basically. Now it's the guidelines. So in the case of the wind power, it was completely unsolicited. It is not government to government, right? Because ironically, the regulator, which was also leaked out, is asking the electricity board, please send us the government to government agreement. There is no agreement.
There's no agreement.
Right? Because Adani is a private businessman. If you do Adani Green Energy, he's invested, it's a huge company. Basically, it's all there. Right? The second thing is that if you have such a fantastic resource, and this is my biggest criticism of both the West Terminal and the Mana, which was, these are natural endowments.
Yeah.
These are quite literally our locational advantages. Mana has an amazing wind resource because of its unique geography relative to India. And if you go and look at Global Wind Atlas, which is a website, you can see that it's a very propitious place because of sheer geography. It's like a wind tunnel there, the landmass, southern tip of India and Sri Lanka. So this is quite literally oil in the ground for us. So if we develop these assets, even geolocation of the Colombo port, you don't need to give any incentive or anything for anybody to come here. Because the profitability of these endeavors on their own are very high. Right? So no incentive is needed because people will line up to come.
Right.
All you need to do.
No need to give tax concessions. And
nothing.
Because or to pay double the price, that's what we're doing, and locked in for 20 plus years.
So when you have such a propitious thing, and what it matters in wind turbines is you can get more usage, because in Mana you get high speed winds consistently, which is just the absolute best location that you can get. And if you look at the Global Wind Atlas, normally the tropics are called the doldrums, they're not that good. So obviously this is a total violation, and the irony about Adani is he can't get projects like this in India. He has to compete and get it, which he's winning.
Which is winning.
Right? Yeah. And he's doing wind power or the company is doing, because he only owns 55% of that Adani Green Energy. They are competing and bidding the lowest price at 3.3 US cents. So they are used to competing in a much bigger market.
Yeah.
So the question is that, is he just being opportunistic? But this is being now facilitated by a very corrupt cabal here, basically, who are enriching themselves also. Because they must be telling these guys, no, look, you can do it for 3.3 in India, we'll give you 8, you give us something. Right. I mean, for me, I don't have any insights, but that's what it looks like.
Yeah. I think that's what it looks like to all of us.
25 versus 1.
Right.
That's $24 times how many? 2.5 million tourists?
You might have less.
Even if you do, even 2? Yeah.
Right. No, so what might happen? You might dissuade people from coming.
It's gone down. Yeah. We are actually on a downward.
And the other point I'd like to make, because you're recording this, is you will dissuade the value-oriented tourists who probably stays at the SMEs.
Yeah, exactly.
The impact to the lower income people is far higher. I mean, a guy who is spending a large amount of money and living in a high-end resort, maybe $25 is not a lot.
Exactly. Well, and over a period of time, that could even normalize.
It might just not to the small amounts.
Yeah. So we've taken a lot of your time. Been very generous. Thank you. But so what I'll do is we'll have one more question, which is more towards policy. So in your opinion, how critical are sort of governance reforms in the broader context of a recovery? And has the IMF diagnostic report and subsequent conditions gone far enough to address the governance and transparency vulnerabilities in Sri Lanka? And what would be your policy recommendations? I mean, these are three sort of things in one. Because we almost, it's 8:45, so we've taken a lot of your time.
So, Chaminda, it's like this, that the government, IMF Governance Diagnostic Assessment Report, which I believe nobody in this room has read.
No, we did.
We did.
Some of them.
Yes.
That's good, because I'm trying to get 1,000 people to read it. And it is being translated into Sinhala and Tamil. I'm told the translation is done, it has to be released. It's a must read. Because if they talked about system change, Lots of things in the system change are in there. The things
And
that are
we
not
recognize
there.
that some of our thing lists
Demands
are
are all
in there.
there.
So
Pretty
that's
much all
why
our
we
demands
ready.
are in there.
Yeah,
So
all of it.
they have focused on economic governance, but we need also political change, the way our system works. So they have said there that economic growth can be 0.6 to 1.1% more, which is a large number.
Yeah.
Because in a base case scenario, the IMF has projected 3%.
Yeah.
Maybe this year it will be a bit better because of the fortuitous weather, etc.
Right.
But they are now forecasting a much lower growth potential because you are carrying an enormous amount of debt. And I told you that no longer can you stimulate through loose monetary or fiscal policy. You could only do it through productivity. Right? So governance basically is a huge drag. So if you improve the governance framework, they have estimated between 0.6 and 1.9. So what that means, how that will play out is that there will be more competition, there will be more productivity, misallocation of resources will reduce. All of that will end up in improving economic performance.
Yeah.
And the trickle down effect is high. The IMF has done an analysis up to I think 2010 from 1978 etc. where they show that from emerging market countries, 58% of issuers who have defaulted once go on to default again. Okay?
They won't.
They will.
They will default.
They
default
will.
again. Yeah, I
So
think
the
we heard
odds
that
are
saying.
against us of not defaulting. Right? So the only way we cannot default is there is a limit of how much tax you can collect. The only way that you cannot default is you have to grow the economy not at 3% by 5% minimum.
Right.
Right? And you can only grow at 5% because if you grow at 5%, there is something called tax buoyancy, which means that when the economy is growing, people have more income, they will buy discretionary products, they'll have more over time, they will be paying taxes at the highest marginal rate.
More robust economic
Yeah,
activity.
that's called tax buoyancy, which means that if the economy grows 10% in nominal terms, your tax revenue will grow 15%. Right? So you catalyze huge amount of virtuous cycles. Right? So if we manage to do that, and we have to grow ourselves out of this is where all this structural reform, etc. is important. But governance is also important because basically decisions are made in the best interests of all of us. Right? If you continue with this captured state, if you do the things that we are doing, the economic efficiency, that is the potential of all of us, because you're wasting time going behind bureaucrats, you're wasting time. Now, all the people who are activists, who are trying to oppose this visa scam, it's taking away time from them. And all of you are at a higher level. So, ideally, it could be put on like doing new stuff, bringing new tourists here. You're wasting time trying to stop these people. So it has a huge implication, and governance basically is the most important item. And I argue that the first thing is for more people to understand what governance means, because
This is what we have been trying for the last 2 years.
There is a very narrow understanding that it is only corruption. It is more than corruption.
Yeah. I think that is where the system change element comes in.
Yeah.
It's not. It's
a mindset.
a holistic approach to almost a society-wide approach to change.
And that is why it's so difficult, because it kind of challenges the existing political order.
Yeah.
Right.
And we can
And
see today
these
what's
1,000
going on.
people are not only politicians. Huh?
Yeah.
They are people in various stratas of society. They are not only business people. There are lots of people who are enjoying privileges.
Officials.
Many others. It cuts across a total society that there are some, I don't know whether you read George Orwell's Animal Farm. He says
Yes,
all
of
animals
course.
are equal.
Yes.
No?
Yeah.
But some animals are
More
more
equal than
so
others.
those some animals are more equal is the problem.
Yeah. We have like you said, at least 1,000 who are far more equal.
Yeah.
Right.
And who call the shots, and we can see that, and this intimidation, the suppression, we are seeing what's going on.
Exactly.
So it is, Angeline, called the iron law of oligarchy. that you have a collapse and a critical juncture, but you have to be very careful that the iron law of oligarchy doesn't. So it's 1,000 people are the oligarchic establishment. That you don't have a new set of people who replace the other lot or part of them who are and they do the same thing.
So this perceived stability that we are kind of experiencing right now allows the status quo to be kind of re-entrenched, so that we don't that
the inertia
people
of that
will,
lot is,
exactly.
is what we are seeing right now. I mean, this lot
there's too
is
much
going
inertia
be,
to change the system anyway.
And like
No,
for instance,
that is, I will qualify that, that the status quo will continue if the citizens do nothing.
Right.
So, like what you are doing, you need activity. I am not talking about being violent, etc. But to start first. And,
which is what we're doing.
And even in a social conversation, don't say flippant comments like, this is Sri Lanka.
Exactly.
Nothing you can say.
Everyone does it, so it's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we see that a lot.
So I think
False equivalence.
I think the system recognizes that. The power of the citizenry, which I think Daragale sort of represented, and every law that has come in subsequently
to suppress
has been to suppress. So we've seen the legislative agenda shows the intent of the incumbent political system and culture.
If you look at the OTA, the ATA,
Bureau of Rehabilitation. I mean, there's so many, right, that has come in.
OSB.
That's
OSB,
OSB. It's all been like a rocket to the heart of activism. Murtaza, thank you so much.
Are we going to
been incredibly enlightening.
The quotes.
Oh yeah, we'll come to the quotes. So generally we end the conversation with a couple of quotes that Leisha picks out every week.
Okay.
But Murtaza, thank you so much. I think we could talk to you for days. I mean, your knowledge on all of this is just incredibly.
And just off the top of your head, all these.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite amazing.
Okay, so my quotes for this week are actually related to what we just talked about in the last.
I just wanted to just before that, we also have a slide of all the scams. If you just turn back, these are the scams that we highlight every week so that people don't forget, right? And one of the things that we don't see in this country is accountability. I think that is why people don't feel like they need to edit their behavior, because there's absolutely no accountability for anything that has gone on in the past. So there's no fear. You know, the scams just keep mounting up and piling up. We can add a lot more. I mean, these are some of the big ones that are in top of mind for us as a group.
Since you mentioned, I'm going to just say one small thing. Can we move forward as a country without accountability for past crime?
Obviously not.
Okay.
And to me, what is there is what happened in the Easter bombing. There was a deep state involved. 300 people died. We know who the assassins were, but who was behind it.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Unless you get a catharsis, how can you move forward?
Right, absolutely. That's something that we've been fighting for.
The reason I asked is we have been told past is the past, we'll look forward, you need to move forward.
Yeah.
But
that's a great argument. If you're trying to protect the status quo, that's a great way of.
All right, that's it. Let's move.
Go ahead, Leisha. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it's related really to the last bit of what we just talked about, and the corruption and all of that, and power and abuse of power and suppression. So my two quotes are this: the accumulation of all power, legislative, executive and judiciary in the same hands, whether one, a few or many, may justly be promoted the very definition of tyranny. James Madison. And personally, I'm seeing a blurring of the lines between the three, the judiciary and the...
Well, the executive is usurping the power from both the other branches.
Exactly, and legislative. And the second quote I have is actually, really it shows with our current president, who was Mr. Clean, who we've all probably voted for many, many, many years. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And look what he's done with it.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
So,
putting you on the
that
spot.
is, Chaminda, the frailties of human beings. Right? So we are all susceptible to that, and that is why you need the system of checks and balances and the design of the political system, knowing the flaws of human beings.
Yeah, exactly. We need strong institutions, checks and balances, systems to work, right? Instead of...
Because the thing is, like, take our executive presidency, it is designed for a benevolent dictator, but as I have said that for every one Lee Kuan Yew, there were 50 Robert Mugabes.
Exactly. Exactly.
We've got one by the looks of it.
Right. We'll wrap it up. We'll wrap it up. Murtaza, thank you so much for joining us today. Day 291 is speeding towards day 300. Right? So congratulations, you guys. I mean, it's an amazing effort that you guys have put in. So that's a big thank you to you, Murtaza, for explaining the complexities of the crisis and IMF and so many other things. Thank you to you guys. Thank you to Anu and Sihe for helping us put this together. And that's a wrap for today. The group will be back in our street corner on Sunday for day 292. So that's it for today. Good night. Thank you. Thanks a lot.